Finally, a smile. We were beginning to think you weren't enjoying yourself.
How could I not, surrounded by such beauty?
Before we go any further, before we get into what really happened, I need you to think about something. What if the person who was truly meant for you looked nothing like what you expected? What if they didn't come from money, didn't have a title, didn't sit at the right tables, or were the right names on their backs? What if the one person who could see straight through all your walls was someone the whole world had already decided didn't matter? This is the story of a man who had everything the world says you're supposed to want. Power, wealth, a name that opened doors before he even reached them. And yet, he was completely alone. Not because no one wanted him. Oh, they wanted him. They lined up for him. But not one of them, not a single one, ever stopped to ask him how he was really doing. Not one of them ever looked past what he had to see who he actually was. Every woman he met saw the house, the cars, the account numbers. They smiled too wide and laughed a little too loud and said all the right things. And he sat there, in the middle of all of it, feeling like the loneliest man on earth. But then, completely by accident, in the quietest, most ordinary way, a girl who swept floors and made beds looked him in the eyes and said something that changed his life forever. And what she said cost her nothing. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't calculated. It was just true. And for a man who had been surrounded by performance his whole life, the truth hit him like cold water. Stay with me, because this story goes places you will not see coming. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's set the scene. His name was Richard Calloway, 53 years old, the founder and chairman of Calloway Capital Group, one of the most quietly powerful real estate and investment firms on the East Coast. If you lived in Connecticut, Maryland, or Virginia, chances are you had walked past a building he owned, eaten in a restaurant he'd financed, or crossed a bridge that his money had helped restore. He was not a flashy man. He drove a modest car. He kept his hair neat and his suits understated. But anyone who knew business, anyone who truly understood the weight of a name, knew that Richard Calloway was not a man you ignored. But here is the thing about Richard that almost nobody knew. For almost a decade, he had stopped trying. He had gone on dates arranged by colleagues and friends. He had attended charity galas with carefully selected women on his arm. He had tried a matchmaker once, a woman who charged $8,000 just to sit across from you and listen for an hour. Nothing worked. Not one of those relationships lasted past 3 months. Not one of those women ever made him feel seen. So he stopped. He closed that door. He poured himself into work. He told himself he was fine alone. He almost believed it. So the question hanging over this whole story, the question I want you to sit with, is this: what exactly do you think a man like Richard needed? What was missing? And when the answer finally arrived, would he even recognize it? To understand Richard Calloway, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the penthouse or the corner office or the boardroom where men twice his age used to take him seriously at 29. You have to go back to a small row house in Baltimore, Maryland, where a woman named Dorothy Calloway raised her son on a hotel housekeeper's salary and the kind of stubborn, quiet dignity that never makes the news but holds families together like concrete. Dorothy Calloway worked at the same hotel for 31 years, the Harborview Grand. She cleaned rooms, pressed sheets, restocked bathrooms, and never once complained, at least not where Richard could hear her. She got up before the sun and came home after it had already gone down. On the nights she came home early enough, she would sit at the kitchen table with Richard and ask him about his day with her whole full attention, like whatever he had to say was the most important thing she'd hear all week. Richard used to think that was just how mothers were. He didn't realize until much later in life how rare it was. His father had left when Richard was 7. Not dramatically. There was no screaming, no broken dishes. He just stopped coming home one Tuesday, and that was that. Richard remembered that Tuesday clearly. He remembered his mother standing in the doorway of the kitchen, very still, staring at the empty chair at the table. She didn't cry in front of him. She never did. She just turned around, opened the refrigerator, and quietly started making dinner. Richard had watched her and thought, even at 7 years old, that she was the strongest person he had ever seen. He had carried that image with him for the rest of his life. That image of a woman who absorbed the weight of everything quietly, without asking for applause. He worked his way through community college, then a state university on a partial scholarship, then a night MBA program while holding down 2 jobs. By 32, he had his first real office. By 40, his company was worth more than he had ever been able to imagine. And through all of it, he kept one ritual that his employees thought was strange, but no one questioned. Once a week, every single Thursday, Richard Calloway had lunch alone in his office with a photograph of his mother on his desk. She had passed away from a stroke 2 years after his company went public, just before she could see how far he'd really gone. He never fully recovered from that. Not really. The women who entered his life after he became wealthy almost never asked about his mother. They asked about the company. They asked about the properties. One woman, a well-dressed attorney he had dated briefly, had visited his office and commented on the photograph on his desk. She had said, "Is that your housekeeper?" And she had laughed, lightly, like it was nothing. And Richard had smiled politely and ended the date 2 hours early and never called her again. He needed something he couldn't put into a job description, something he had grown up watching. That specific, quiet kind of love, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that shows up anyway, tired and underpaid, and still makes dinner. He just had no idea where to find it. The house in Annapolis had been in the family for years, a colonial-style property with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and a wide back porch that overlooked a stretch of water that turned gold in the evenings. Richard had inherited it from his mother's sister and had done little with it other than keep it maintained. He rarely stayed there. But in the spring of 2019, after a brutal quarter of negotiations and a lawsuit that had dragged on for 2 years and finally settled, he decided he needed to step away from the city. He packed a bag and drove down to Annapolis and told his assistant he was unavailable for 3 weeks. He hired a local housekeeping service to come in twice a week. Standard arrangement. He had used similar services in his other properties. He expected efficiency, anonymity, and minimal disruption. What he did not expect was Margaret. Margaret Osei had worked for that housekeeping company for 11 years. She was 51, Ghanaian-American, with warm brown eyes and a way of moving through a space that managed to be both thorough and gentle. Like she was taking care of the things in a room, not just cleaning them. She had raised her daughter mostly alone after her husband's passing nearly a decade earlier. She was not a loud woman. She did not make small talk. She came in, did her work with a focused calm that Richard noticed immediately, and left. The first time they spoke, truly spoke, was on a Tuesday morning when Richard came down earlier than expected and found Margaret in the kitchen, kneeling on the floor, carefully cleaning along the baseboard of the cabinet with a soft cloth. He had stood there for a moment and said, "You don't have to do that." And Margaret had looked up at him, not startled, not flustered, and said simply, "I know, but it needed doing." And then she went right back to her work. Richard stood there a moment longer than necessary. He couldn't explain why. There was something in the way she said it. "I know, but it needed doing." Like care was its own answer. Like it didn't require a reason beyond itself. He started coming down earlier on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He would make a pot of coffee, 2 cups, and leave one on the counter without saying anything. The first time, Margaret had seen it, paused, and then said, "Thank you," without making anything out of it. That was that. Within 2 weeks, they were talking. Not deeply at first. Weather. The town. The water out back. She had lived in Annapolis for 20 years, she told him, and knew every inlet. He had owned a house there for 7 years and had never learned the name of the street behind him. She found that gently, privately amusing. He could tell. One afternoon, a Thursday, the week before he was due to go back to the city, Richard was sitting on the back porch with his phone and a contract he was supposed to be reviewing. He wasn't reading it. He was staring at the water. Margaret came out to let him know she was done and found him sitting very still with the look of a man who was somewhere far away. She paused at the door and said, "You look tired." Not in a pitying way, just as a statement, like she was reading the room. Richard put down the contract and said, "I am." And for some reason he didn't fully understand. He told her the truth about the lawsuit, about the quarter, about the fact that his mother had loved this house and used to sit in that exact chair and watch the water for an hour every morning, and he hadn't been here in 4 years because it made him miss her too much. He said all of that in about 60 seconds and then stopped, surprised at himself. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down, not at the table, just on the step of the porch, and she said, My husband used to sit on our porch every morning too. After he was gone, I couldn't go out there for almost a year. Then one day I made myself do it. And I just cried the whole time. But I went back the next day, and eventually it stopped hurting as much. She paused. The chair doesn't take them away, but it can give you them back a little bit. Then she said goodbye and walked home. Richard sat on that porch until well past dark. He didn't review the contract. He didn't answer his phone. He just sat. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel quite so alone. He extended his stay in Annapolis by 2 weeks. If this story has your heart already stirring, go ahead and comment. I'm still watching. Let's see who's truly following till the end. He went back to the city eventually. Of course he did. There were meetings and calls and obligations that couldn't wait any longer. But something had shifted in him, quietly, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. He found himself thinking about the porch, about the coffee cups, about the way Margaret had said, the chair doesn't take them away, but it can give you them back a little bit. He had written it down in his notebook that night and underlined it twice. He did not act on anything. He was a careful man, a man who had learned, through the particular education of wealth, that people were not always what they appeared. He had been let down by people who smiled warmly and meant none of it. He was not about to be careless now, no matter how a conversation on a porch had made him feel. So he went back to his life. He worked. He attended events. He did what was expected of him. But 3 months later, he called the housekeeping service and asked for the Annapolis house to be opened up again. He said he'd be spending more time there. His assistant raised an eyebrow. Richard had never expressed interest in Annapolis before, but said nothing and made the arrangements. And so the Thursday conversations resumed. Slowly, carefully. They talked about everything and nothing. Her daughter, Abina, who was studying for her nursing boards in Baltimore. His mother's piano that still sat in the parlor no one ever entered. What Margaret thought of the family that had lived on the cul-de-sac 2 houses down and finally put up a fence after 30 years. They laughed. Not the polished laughter of a dinner party, but the real kind. The kind that catches you off guard and sounds a little louder than you meant. He began noticing things. The way she hummed when she was concentrating. The specific, deliberate care she put into folding things. The fact that she always looked people in the eye when she spoke to them. Not aggressively, just honestly. The way people do when they've earned their own respect and don't need to borrow anyone else's. He noticed that she never asked him about money. Never. In a life where almost every conversation eventually curved back toward what he had, Margaret talked to him like a person. But he also noticed something else. Something that troubled him. The work was wearing on her. She was 51 years old and spending her days on her knees cleaning baseboards and lifting mattresses and standing for 6, 7 hours at a time. He had seen her wince once, just once, quickly covered, when she had leaned down for too long. He hadn't said anything then, but it stayed with him. He tried, gently, to ask her once about it, whether she had considered other work, other options. She had looked at him with that calm, level gaze of hers and said, "I do what I know how to do. It keeps Abina in school. That's enough for me." And the way she said it, the complete absence of self-pity, the absolute sincerity of putting her daughter first without drama, it stopped his throat. This was exactly it, he realized. This was exactly what he had been watching his mother do his entire childhood and had spent his whole adult life trying to find again in someone else. Not neediness, not performance, just love as action. Love is showing up and doing what needed to be done without asking anyone to applaud you for it. He was 53 years old, and he was falling for the woman who cleaned his house. And he didn't know what on earth to do about it. Now, here's what I want to ask you, and I want you to really think about this. Have you ever met someone who made you feel seen in a way that you couldn't quite explain? Someone who didn't try to impress you, didn't need anything from you, and still managed to make you feel like the room got a little brighter when they were in it? Think about that person. Because that is exactly what was happening to Richard Calloway in a house in Annapolis on Thursday mornings. Over 2 cups of coffee that neither of them ever commented on, but both of them kept showing up for. Meanwhile, 60 miles away in Baltimore, Abina Osei was studying for her nursing board exams in a studio apartment that smelled like instant noodles and highlighter ink. She was 26 years old, quietly brilliant in the way that people who work hard in silence often are, and completely unaware of the fact that anything unusual was happening in her mother's life. Margaret didn't mention Richard. She didn't see the point in mentioning something she didn't fully understand herself. She just came home on Thursday evenings a little quieter than usual, sat at the kitchen table with her tea, and smiled at something she didn't explain. Abina noticed. Of course she did. She had spent her whole life reading her mother's silences. She had learned to decode them the way you learn the specific language of someone you love, the particular quality of a pause that means everything is fine, versus the particular quality of a pause that means something is turning over inside. This was the second kind. But her mother's eyes were soft when she smiled, not worried. So Abina let it be. She had her own worries to carry. The exams were brutal. The student loans were real. She worked part-time as a patient care technician at a hospital 3 evenings a week, and the shifts left her wrung out and buzzing with something she couldn't name, some combination of exhaustion and purpose that she was only beginning to recognize as the feeling of a calling. She loved patients in the specific way that the best nurses do, not performatively, but quietly, precisely, the way her mother loved everything. Like care was its own reward. She had met her mother's employer once, briefly, in passing. She had gone to Annapolis to drop off some paperwork her mother had forgotten, and Richard had been in the driveway. He had been polite. He had looked directly at her and said, "You must be Abina. Your mother talks about you all the time." And something in the way he said it, the warmth of it, the lack of pretense, had registered with her. She had driven home and thought, that was not what she expected from a man who owned the kind of house she just stood in front of. She filed it away. She went back to her studies. She had exams to pass. It was a Friday evening in November when everything changed. Richard was in the city for meetings. Margaret was at the Annapolis house for a scheduled cleaning. She had a spare key for when Richard was away. She had finished the upstairs and had come down to the kitchen when she felt it, a sharpness in her chest, sudden and deep, different from anything she had felt before. She sat down at the kitchen table. She told herself it was indigestion. It was not indigestion. By the time she managed to call Abina, she could barely speak clearly. Abina, who had learned in her training to listen past words to what the body was communicating, heard her mother's voice and knew before Margaret even finished the sentence. She told her mother to unlock the front door and stay seated and called 911 and was already in her car before she hung up. Richard got the call 40 minutes later. It was not from Margaret. She was already in the ambulance. It was from Abina, who had found his number in her mother's phone under Mr. Calloway, and called because she thought he should know and because she didn't have anyone else at that moment to call. She was calm on the phone the way nurses train to be calm, but Richard could hear underneath the calm the tremor of a daughter who was frightened. He told her which hospital he was closest to. He was in his car before the call ended. He drove to Annapolis General in the dark and arrived to find Abina sitting in a plastic waiting room chair in her coat with her hands folded in her lap and a look on her face that Richard recognized immediately. The focused, contained stillness of someone holding it together out of necessity. He sat down next to her without asking permission. He said, "She's tough. I know that about her." And Abina looked at him, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time, and said, "Yeah, she is." And then, quietly, to her own surprise, she put her face in her hands and took one long, shaking breath. And Richard sat next to her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and that was exactly right. Margaret had had a heart attack. Moderate, the cardiologist said. Caught in time. She would need rest, medication, follow-up care. She would recover. But she would need to stop doing physically demanding work, at least for several months, possibly permanently. When the doctor delivered that news, Margaret's first words, spoken from a hospital bed with wires on her chest and in 4 in her arm, were, "How is Abina going to finish her boards?" Not a question, a statement. The same statement she had been making her whole life in different forms. Other people first, always. She had been having a heart attack, and her first complete sentence was about her daughter's nursing exams. Richard stood in the doorway of that room and felt something break open in him the way things break open when they've been held together too long. He went home that night and sat at his desk for 2 hours. Then he made a list. Not the kind of list a wealthy man makes when he wants to feel powerful. A quiet list. A careful one. He wrote down what Margaret needed medically, what she would lose financially without work, what Abina's remaining program costs were, what options existed. He was very, very precise. He had learned from his mother that precision was how you love people when the feeling is too large for words. What happened next is not what you think. And I want to be very careful here, because this is the part people get wrong. This is where most stories become something simple and neat. A rich man writes a check. The end. This was not that. 2 days later, Richard went to the hospital. He brought 2 things: a pot of soup from a restaurant Margaret had once mentioned in passing as her favorite, and a plain envelope. Inside the envelope was not a check. It was a letter. 2 pages, handwritten, which Richard Calloway, a man who communicated almost exclusively through contracts and typed memos, had written by hand at his desk the night before, tearing up 3 drafts before he got it right. He handed her the soup first. She laughed, a real, hoarse, surprised laugh, and said, "How did you even remember that?" He said, "You mentioned it once." I remembered. And that said everything. Then he handed her the envelope. He said, "Before you read that, I want to say something. I'm not giving you this because I feel sorry for you. I'm not giving you this because of your situation. I'm giving you this because you are one of the most remarkable people I have ever known, and I should have said that a long time ago. What's in there is not charity. It's honesty. And the rest, whatever you make of it, is entirely yours to decide." Margaret read the letter slowly. Abina, who had been sitting in the corner chair, watched her mother's face. She watched it move through surprise and confusion, and then something softer. Something that looked, in the afternoon light of that hospital room, very much like being understood. The letter said several things. That Abina's remaining program costs would be covered in full, no conditions, no expectations, because the world needed more nurses who had been raised by women like Margaret. That Margaret herself had a standing offer of a position, not a housekeeping position, but a household manager role at a salary that would let her work seated, set her own hours, and hire the people under her, at whatever time and in whatever way she felt ready, if she wanted it, if she ever wanted it. And at the end, after all the practical things, which Richard had put first on purpose so the last part would land where he meant it to, the letter said, "I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who saw what I had and nothing else. You saw me. I don't think you even know that you did. But you did. And I don't want to leave this hospital without you knowing that it mattered more to me than I have the right words for." Margaret folded the letter. She was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at Richard, who was sitting across from her trying very hard to look like a man who had not just said the most vulnerable thing he had said in 20 years, and she said, "You wrote this yourself, didn't you?" It wasn't really a question. He said yes. She said, "I can tell. It sounds like you." And she smiled. Abina sat in the corner and looked at her hands, and then at the ceiling, and then quietly out the window. Because she was 26 and she understood something her mother might have taken longer to say out loud. That something had just shifted in this room, and it was real, and it was going to change their lives, and it was good. Margaret Osei recovered over the next several months. She moved out of the studio apartment she'd rented for years and into a comfortable place closer to Abina in Baltimore while she healed. Richard called on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not because they'd arranged it, but because the rhythm had established itself somewhere along the line and felt natural to both of them. He would call while he was having his lunch alone at his desk, and she would talk to him from whatever chair she was resting in that day. And they would cover enormous distances in 30-minute phone calls, childhood memories, old embarrassments, the specific strange grief of people who have lost parents, the question of what you do with the rest of your life once you've survived the hardest parts of it. 6 months after the hospital, Richard drove to Baltimore on a Saturday morning for no stated reason and showed up at Margaret's door with 2 cups of coffee from the place she had mentioned she liked. She opened the door, looked at the cups, looked at him, and said, "You remembered again." He said, "I always remember." And she let him in. Abina passed her nursing boards 3 months later. She called her mother first, who cried. She called Richard second, by then. That had become a natural thing to do, who said, "Of course you did," in the calm, certain tone of a man who had never doubted it for a second. She stood in her hallway holding her phone and laughed at the ceiling. There was no dramatic proposal, no grand gesture designed for an audience. What there was, in a kitchen in Baltimore, on an ordinary Saturday evening in April, with a pot of something simmering on the stove, was Richard saying quietly, "I don't want to do any of this without you." And Margaret, who had spent her whole life being necessary and almost never being chosen, said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I know." And then, softly, "Me neither." They were married the following spring. A small ceremony. Abina was the only person who cried, though Richard came close. Dorothy Calloway's photograph was on the table near the flowers. Margaret had suggested that, which told Richard everything he needed to know about the woman he was standing next to. And now, here is the part of this story I want to sit with you in, just for a moment, before we close. None of the women Richard had dated over the years were bad people. They were just looking at him the wrong way. They saw the portfolio. They saw the properties and the company and the corner office. They saw what he had built and mistook it for what he was. And so they were always reaching for something that was in his hands, never for something that was in his heart. Margaret had never once reached for anything he had. She had only ever responded to who he was. The man who kept his mother's photograph on his desk. The man who left coffee out without making anything of it. The man who drove in the dark to a waiting room because someone he cared about was scared. She had seen that man clearly, not because she was special in some impossible, fairy tale way, but because she was the kind of person who paid attention to the things that other people were too busy or too distracted to notice. And Abina, who grew up watching her mother love the world quietly, without needing credit for it, turned out to be the kind of young woman who could recognize real goodness when she sat across from it in a driveway in Annapolis. She had looked at Richard Calloway once, briefly, in passing, and thought, that's not what I expected. Because real goodness rarely looks like what we've been told to expect. It just shows up. It brings soup. It writes letters by hand. It sits next to you in waiting rooms without needing to be asked. Here is what I believe this story is really about. It is not about money. It is not about class. It is about what we've been trained to see and all the things we miss because of it. We are told to look for certain signals, certain markers, certain shapes of a life. And in the middle of looking for all of that, the real thing walks right past us quietly, doing its work, not asking to be noticed. And sometimes, if we are paying attention, if we slow down enough, if we are not too full of what we think we know, we see it. And everything changes. Margaret didn't set out to change a man's life. She was just doing her work. Honestly, with care. The way her mother had taught her, and the way she had taught Abina, and the way some things quietly pass forward through generations when the people doing the teaching are too busy to make speeches about it. And that, I think, is the most important thing. The people who change our lives most deeply are almost never trying to. They are just being themselves. Fully, honestly, without performance. And we, the lucky ones, happen to be in the right room on the right morning when they look up from what they're doing and say simply, I know. But it needed doing. Now before I let you go, I want you to think about something. If you were Richard, surrounded by people who only ever wanted what you had, would you have been able to trust something quiet and real when it finally showed up? Or would you have been so trained to expect performance that you would have missed the one genuine thing? I want you to answer that honestly in the comments below, because I think a lot of us have been in that room. A lot of us have been so used to noise that we no longer recognize silence as a gift. And what about Margaret? This woman who worked herself to the bone, who put her daughter first every single day for over a decade, who never asked anyone to see her, and was still seen when the right person came along. Does her story give you hope? Does it remind you of someone you know? Maybe someone in your own family, someone who has spent a lifetime doing the quiet, unglamorous work of love without ever asking to be celebrated for it? Tell me about them in the comments. I mean that. I want to hear. And Abina, who grew up watching her mother and learned without being taught how to recognize a good person when she met one. Think about the young people in your life. What are they learning from watching you? What are they quietly absorbing from the way you move through the world? That question sits with me every time I tell a story like this one. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you feel something you needed to feel, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Not for the numbers, just because some stories deserve to travel. And to everyone watching from wherever you are in this world, thank you. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. It means more than you know. We'll see you in the next one. And if you think this story touched your heart, just wait until you hear what we have coming next. It is the kind of story that will stay with you for days. Subscribe so you don't miss it.